August 20, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The mud churned under spinning tires as 19 Grumman F-4F Wildcats touched down on a hastily finished airstrip carved from a jungle swamp. Their pilots, young Marines who'd never fired a shot in anger, climbed out into air thick with mosquitoes and the smell of rotting vegetation. Above them, storm clouds gathered. Not the tropical kind, the kind with rising sun insignias painted on their wings. These weren't the glamorous fighters America dreamed about. The Wildcat was slower, heavier, less maneuverable than the Japanese Zero, a plane so advanced it had shocked the world. On paper, it was no contest. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outrun the stubby Grumman. Japanese aces had been training for a decade. These American kids had months. What happened next shouldn't have been possible. Over the next 6 months, in one of the most brutal aerial campaigns of World War II, these inferior fighters and their green pilots would achieve something extraordinary. They would shatter the myth of Zero invincibility and turn the tide of the Pacific War. By the time the smoke cleared in February 1943, Wildcats were shooting down nearly 6 Japanese planes for every one they lost. By war's end, that ratio would climb to 7-to-1. This is the story of how the slow plane won, how American ingenuity, teamwork, and raw courage transformed a technical disadvantage into devastating superiority. It's about 2 Navy pilots who figured out the secret at a kitchen table with matchsticks. About a farm boy from South Dakota who became America's deadliest ace. About Marines who slept in bomb craters and flew with malaria because Henderson Field could not fall. The Japanese never understood what hit them, because this wasn't about the plane. It was about the men who flew it and the tactics that changed aerial combat forever. If you want to witness the full story of aviation's greatest underdog victory, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below. This documentary contains no AI narration, just verified history and the truth about the forgotten fighter. Let's begin where it started, with a puzzle no one thought could be solved. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. When Japanese carrier planes struck the Pacific Fleet, American pilots got their first terrifying glimpse of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Intelligence reports had warned about a new Japanese fighter, but nothing prepared them for the reality. The Zero could climb 5,000 feet per minute, faster than any American fighter. It turned so tightly that experienced pilots swore it violated the laws of physics. With a range of 1,160 miles, it could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still have fuel to dogfight home. The secret lay in its construction. Japanese engineers at Mitsubishi had developed extra super duralan, an aluminum alloy stronger and lighter than anything the West possessed. Every ounce was calculated. The Zero had no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal radio equipment. It was a flying razor blade, beautiful and deadly. Against this technological marvel, the U.S. Navy fielded the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a design that had barely won its own competition trials. The Wildcat was everything the Zero wasn't. It weighed 2,600 pounds more, with only 250 additional horsepower. It was slower by 13 to 20 miles per hour. Its turn radius was wider. Its climb rate was inferior. On paper, sending Wildcats against Zeros was sending men to their deaths. But the Wildcat had something the Zero didn't. It could take punishment. Grumman built the F-4F like a flying tank. Armor plating protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant a single bullet wouldn't turn the plane into a fireball. The structure was reinforced to survive carrier landings and Japanese cannon fire. It mounted 6.50 caliber machine guns with devastating stopping power. The question facing American commanders in early 1942 was simple and terrible. How do you fight a superior enemy when you're stuck with inferior equipment? The answer wouldn't come from factories or engineers. It would come from two brilliant tacticians, one kitchen table, and a box of matchsticks on a California evening in the summer of 1941. Their solution would save thousands of American lives and change aerial combat forever. Coronado, California, summer 1941. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch sat at his kitchen table long after midnight, moving matchsticks across the wood surface. His wife had gone to bed hours ago, but Thatch couldn't sleep. On September 22, 1941, he'd read a Fleet Air Tactical Unit intelligence bulletin about the Zero's performance in China. The numbers were devastating. Thatch knew what was coming. War with Japan was inevitable. And when it came, American pilots would face an opponent that could outfly them in every measurable category. The standard three-plane formation wouldn't work. It left pilots isolated and vulnerable. He needed something radical, something that turned the Wildcats' weaknesses into strengths. Night after night, he pushed matchsticks around, simulating attacks and defenses. The breakthrough came in a moment of clarity. What if two fighters, flying side by side, turned toward each other when attacked? The enemy pilot, focused on one target, the bait, would suddenly find himself flying into the guns of the bait's wingman, the hook. After crossing, they'd separate and do it again, creating a continuous weaving pattern. It looked simple. It was brilliant. Thatch called it beam defense position. He tested it with Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare, the future ace, playing the attacker. Even with throttles wired to handicap the defenders, O'Hare couldn't make a successful attack. "Skipper, it really worked," O'Hare said after landing. "I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me." But Thatch needed confirmation. He shared his idea with Lieutenant Commander James H. Flatley, executive officer of VF-42, and a fierce intellect in his own right. Flatley tested both four-plane and six-plane variations. His conclusion: the four-plane division is the only thing that will work. It was Flatley who gave it the name that would echo through aviation history: the Thatch Weave. On June 4, 1942, at the Battle of Midway, Thatch put his tactic to the ultimate test. Zeros swarmed his formation. Following the weave, his outnumbered pilots survived and shot down multiple enemy fighters. The tactic worked. Now it needed to be spread throughout the fleet, fast. Because in August, Marines would need every advantage they could get. August 7, 1942, Operation Watchtower. 11,000 U.S. Marines splashed ashore on Guadalcanal's beaches, expecting fierce resistance. They found construction equipment, half-eaten meals, and an abandoned airfield. The Japanese garrison had fled into the jungle, leaving behind a nearly complete runway that would change everything. Intelligence had discovered this airfield through aerial reconnaissance. If the Japanese finished it, they would dominate the entire South Pacific. Bombers from Guadalcanal could strike Allied supply lines to Australia, cutting off the lifeline that kept resistance alive. The invasion, America's first offensive operation of World War II, was a race against time. By August 8, Marines had secured the airfield and renamed it Henderson Field, honoring Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine aviator killed leading his squadron at Midway. Navy Seabees worked around the clock, filling bomb craters, improving drainage, and preparing the muddy strip for combat operations. On August 12, a PBY Catalina made the first landing. The pilot declared the field ready for fighters. 8 days later, history arrived on Navy wings. 31 aircraft launched from the escort carrier USS Long Island south of Guadalcanal, 19 F-4F-4 Wildcats and 12 SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Leading them was Marine Air Group 23, with VMF 223 commanded by Captain John L. Smith and VMF 224. These pilots would become the nucleus of what reporters would call the Cactus Air Force, using Cactus as the radio code name for Guadalcanal. The conditions were medieval. Pilots lived in mud-floored tents in a flooded coconut plantation nicknamed Mosquito Grove. The airfield was bombed nearly every day around noon by Japanese Betty bombers flying in perfect V formations at 20,000 feet, escorted by Zeros. At night, Japanese warships shelled the field with devastating accuracy. To survive the bombardments, some pilots slept in the front lines with infantry. They had minimal supplies, little maintenance equipment, and chronic fuel shortages. Breakfast was often rice captured from the Japanese. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever ravaged the ranks. Yet these men were about to fight one of the most crucial air campaigns in history. On August 24, the battle began in earnest, and one pilot would make Marine Corps history. August 24, 1942. 27-year-old First Lieutenant Marion Eugene Carl scanned the sky above Guadalcanal, his Wildcat responding to every touch. He'd flown in the Battle of Midway 2 months earlier, scoring his first kill against a Zero. Now based at Henderson Field for just 4 days, he was about to write his name in the record books. The Coast Watchers, brave souls hidden on islands between Rabaul and Guadalcanal, had radioed a warning. Japanese bombers were coming. The primitive radar confirmed it. Large formation, high altitude, inbound. Carl and his squadron from VMF 223 scrambled into the tropical heat, climbing for altitude advantage. They found them at 25,000 feet. Zeros escorting Betty bombers and Kate torpedo bombers. Carl's fighter doctrine kicked in. Avoid turning fights, use speed and diving attacks, don't get drawn into the Zeros game. He dove from above, guns blazing. The first Zero never saw him coming. Tracers from 6.5 caliber guns, 3,600 rounds per minute, ripped through the Japanese fighter. It fell in flames. Carl didn't celebrate. He spotted a Betty bomber, vulnerable without its escort. His bullets found the engines. The bomber tumbled toward the ocean below. Before the day ended, Carl had shot down 4 enemy aircraft, 1 Zero, 1 Betty, and 2 Kate torpedo bombers. Combined with his Midway victory, he now had 5 aerial kills. By the U.S. military's definition, Marion Carl had become the Marine Corps' first ace of World War II. But the celebration was brief. The Japanese weren't giving up Henderson Field without a fight. Throughout September, the tempo of raids increased. Carl himself was shot down on September 9 and went missing for 5 days before island natives returned him to American lines. The psychological pressure was immense. Death could come from any direction, at any moment. Yet something was changing in the skies over Guadalcanal. American pilots were learning. The thatch weave was being adopted by Marine squadrons. Intelligence from the captured Zero in Alaska, repaired and tested by September 1942, refined their tactics further. The Wildcat's weaknesses could be managed, its strengths could be maximized. The kill ratio was shifting, and reinforcements were coming. October 9, 1942. A new squadron catapulted from the escort carrier USS Copiahe. Captain Joseph Jacob Foss, a 27-year-old farm boy from South Dakota, led his division toward Henderson Field. At an age when most fighter pilots were considered too old for combat, Foss had fought bureaucracy for years just to get here. He'd logged 150 flight hours in Wildcats in just 6 weeks, determined to master every capability of the aircraft. Now, as executive officer of VMF 121, he was about to enter the crucible. Landing on what pilots called the cow pasture, Foss assessed the situation with a practiced eye. The field was pocked with bomb craters. Wrecked aircraft littered the perimeter. Living conditions were brutal, but the Marines had grit and 3 batteries of 90mm anti-aircraft guns. 2 radar stations provided precious minutes of warning before Japanese raids. 4 days later, on October 13th, Foss scored his first kill. But it was almost his last mission. A Zero appeared from nowhere, overshot his Wildcat, and flew directly into Foss's sights. His finger squeezed the trigger. The Zero exploded. But 3 more were on his tail, cannon fire ripping through his aircraft. With a dead engine and no flaps, Foss dove for Henderson Field at full speed, barely missing a palm tree grove as he slammed onto the runway. That night, as 2 Japanese battleships Haruna and Kongo hurled more than 700 shells into Henderson Field, the worst bombardment of the campaign, Foss understood the stakes. If the airfield fell, Guadalcanal fell. If Guadalcanal fell, the entire Pacific strategy collapsed. He named his flight Foss's Flying Circus, 8 Wildcats divided into farm boys and city slickers. The pilots were young, but Foss drilled them relentlessly in the thatch weave and hit-and-run tactics. Never turn with a Zero. Always maintain altitude advantage. Use teamwork and communication. The Wildcat's superior firepower and structural strength would do the rest. Within 13 days, Foss shot down 14 enemy aircraft. The Flying Circus was racking up kills at a staggering rate. But the Japanese were preparing their biggest offensive yet. And the worst fighting was still to come. The secret to the Wildcats' growing success wasn't just tactics. It was understanding the Zero's fatal flaw. Above 280 miles per hour, the Zero's controls began to stiffen noticeably. At 300 mph, rolling the aircraft became difficult. Above 350 miles per hour, the elevators and ailerons were nearly impossible to move. The large control surfaces, which gave the Zero its legendary maneuverability at low speeds, became a catastrophic liability at high speeds. The Wildcat had no such problems. Grumman engineers had installed servo tabs on all control surfaces, small mechanical aids that countered aerodynamic forces. A Wildcat pilot could dive at maximum speed and still maintain full control. This meant a simple but devastating tactic. Attack from above, fire a burst, then dive away before the Zero could respond. By the time the Japanese pilot regained maneuverability, the Wildcat was climbing back to altitude for another pass. American pilots called it boom and zoom. Dive, shoot, zoom. Never state a dogfight. Never give the Zero the turning battle it was designed to win. Combined with the thatch weave for defensive situations, these tactics transformed the Wildcat from an inferior fighter into a killing machine. But tactics alone don't win wars. Training does. U.S. Navy and Marine pilots received extensive gunnery training, hours of practice shooting at towed targets, learning deflection angles and lead calculations. When a Wildcat 6.50 caliber guns hit, they hit hard. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute. All 6 guns combined could deliver 4,800 rounds per minute, enough to shred a Zero's unarmored airframe in seconds. The Zero, for all its strengths, had a critical weakness. It carried only 60 rounds for each of its 2 20mm cannons, about 10 seconds of firing time. Miss with those shots, and the Zero was reduced to 2 7.7mm machine guns, pea shooters compared to American firepower. Perhaps most crucially, American doctrine began rotating experienced pilots back to training squadrons, spreading combat knowledge to new pilots. The Japanese kept their aces at the front until they were killed or incapacitated. By late 1942, as Midway and Guadalcanal decimated the experienced Japanese pilot cadre, American experience levels were increasing while Japanese experience plummeted. The tide was turning, and it was about to become a tsunami. November 7, 1942. The Japanese were coming in force. Coast watchers reported a massive formation, Japanese cruiser, 10 destroyers heading down the slot toward Guadalcanal. American torpedo bombers and dive bombers scrambled to intercept, escorted by Foss's Flying Circus. The Wildcats climbed to altitude, eyes scanning the horizon for the inevitable fighter cover. They appeared like a swarm of angry wasps. Nakajima float planes and Mitsubishi fighters rising to defend the naval force. Foss led his division into the chaos. In the wild dogfight that followed, he claimed 3 enemy aircraft. But as he lined up his third kill, the rear gunner in the Japanese plane got lucky. Bullets punched through Foss's engine. Oil pressure dropped to 0. Engine temperature spiked. Foss radioed his position and ditched in the ocean off the island of Malaita. For hours he bobbed in his life raft, watching sharks circle, wondering if rescue would come before the Japanese did. A PBY Catalina flying boat finally spotted him and executed a dangerous water landing to pull him from the sea. 5 days later, Foss was back in the cockpit. By mid-November, he'd shot down 19 enemy aircraft. His division was becoming legendary, the most effective fighter unit in the theater. But on November 12, the Japanese launched their most determined effort yet to retake Henderson Field. 16 Betty bombers with 30 Zero escorts headed for American transports bringing reinforcements to Guadalcanal. Foss's 8 Wildcats and 4 Army P-38s rose to meet them. 12 fighters against 46 enemy aircraft. The odds were impossible. Foss didn't care. "Tally-ho," he called, and dove into the formation. What followed was the kind of aerial combat that would be studied in military academies for decades. Foss and his wingmen used every tactic they'd learned. The thatch weave to shake pursuing Zeros, boom and zoom attacks on the bombers, coordinated crossfire that left no escape routes. Foss personally shot down 3 Bettys and a Zero in the chaos. American and Japanese strike forces clashed in a 3-day naval and air battle that would determine Guadalcanal's fate. The Cactus Air Force fought with everything they had, and they were winning. November 15, 1942, the battle reached its crescendo. Foss woke before dawn, his body shaking uncontrollably. Malaria, the scourge of the South Pacific, had finally caught him. His temperature spiked above 104 degrees. Medical officers evacuated him to a hospital near Sydney, Australia. By then, he'd shot down 23 enemy aircraft in just over a month of combat. His squadron had accounted for more than 60 victories. But the Cactus Air Force had paid a terrible price. Between August 20 and November 15, 1942, they'd lost 118 aircraft shot down and another 30 to operational accidents. 84 pilots had been killed, including 38 fighter pilots in aerial combat. Henderson Field had been bombed, shelled, and assaulted almost daily for 3 months. Yet they'd held. More importantly, they'd broken the back of Japanese naval aviation. Japanese losses were staggering, approximately 650 aircraft destroyed between August and November 1942, most of them to F-4F Wildcats. Hundreds of experienced pilots, men who'd trained for years before the war, were dead. The Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm would never fully recover from the savage attrition of those months. The kill ratio told the story. In the early battles of 1942, Coral Sea and the raids before Midway, Wildcats and Zeros had traded losses roughly evenly, with perhaps a slight American advantage. By the Battle of Midway in June, American tactics had improved enough to hold their own. But by the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, the numbers were devastating. Wildcats were shooting down 5.9 Japanese aircraft for every American loss. This wasn't luck. This was systematic destruction built on superior tactics, better training, and pilots who'd learned to maximize their aircraft's strengths while exploiting the enemy's weaknesses. Brigadier General Roy S. Geiger, who took command of the Cactus Air Force on September 3, had held the unit together through sheer force of personality during the darkest days. Now, as Japanese attacks tapered off and the last Tokyo Express convoy ran on November 30, victory was in sight. By December, Henderson Field had grown from 31 original aircraft to more than 150. Ground fighting continued, but the air battle was effectively over. In February 1943, the Japanese evacuated their remaining forces from Guadalcanal. The island and its crucial airfield belonged to America. January 1st, 1943. Joe Foss returned to Guadalcanal, recovered from malaria but gaunt from the illness. The new year brought new challenges. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, was planning Operation Igo, a desperate offensive to regain air superiority in the Solomons. But Foss had unfinished business. On January 15th, he shot down 3 more enemy aircraft, bringing his total to 26, matching Eddie Rickenbacker's American record from World War I. 10 days later, on January 25, Foss would cement his legend. Coastwatchers reported a massive formation approaching, 100 Japanese bombers and fighters heading for Guadalcanal. Foss led his 8 Wildcats and 4 Army P-38 Lightnings to intercept, 12 against 100. "Let's use the clouds," Foss radioed. His pilots darted in and out of overcast conditions, making the Japanese believe they faced a much larger force. The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese bomber formations broke up. Escort fighters scattered trying to cover too many threats. Foss's flying circus shot down 4 fighters and damaged numerous bombers before the enemy force turned back. Mission unaccomplished. It was vintage Foss. Aggressive tactics, perfect teamwork, and the kind of leadership that inspired men to attempt the impossible. For his actions from October 9 to November 19, 1942, and his continued excellence in January 1943, Captain Joseph Jacob Foss received the Medal of Honor. His citation read, "For outstanding heroism and courage above and beyond the call of duty. Personally shot down 23 Japanese planes and damaged others so severely that their destruction was extremely probable. Boldly searching out an approaching enemy force, undaunted by tremendously superior numbers." Foss would survive the war and become South Dakota's governor, president of the National Rifle Association, and the first commissioner of the American Football League. But his most important contribution had already been made, in the skies over Guadalcanal. By February 1943, the first F-4U Corsairs were arriving to replace the F-4F Wildcats as the primary fighter. The Wildcat had done its job. Against all odds, the slow plane had won. The kill ratio by war's end would climb to 6.9 to 1, nearly 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Wildcat lost. But how was this possible? How did the supposedly inferior fighter dominate the supposedly superior Zero? The answer lies in a truth that military historians still study today. In warfare, the quality of the machine matters less than the quality of the men who use it and the tactics they employ. The Wildcat succeeded because American pilots and commanders refused to fight the enemy's battle. They studied the Zero's weaknesses with scientific precision. The captured Zero in Alaska, repaired and tested by September 1942, provided invaluable data. American test pilots discovered the control stiffening at high speeds, the lack of armor, the limited ammunition, all the vulnerabilities that combat pilots could exploit. James Flatley, who'd helped validate the thatch weave, put it perfectly. "Let us not be too critical of our equipment. It shoots the enemy down in flames and brings most of us home." He wasn't denying the Zero's superiority in certain metrics. He was pointing out that aerial combat isn't about one-dimensional performance. It's about combined arms, aircraft capability, pilot skill, tactical doctrine, maintenance, logistics, intelligence, and leadership. The Wildcat's structural strength meant pilots came home from battles that would have killed them in a Zero. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires. Armor plating stopped machine gun rounds. These survivability features created a virtuous cycle. Experienced pilots lived to pass on their knowledge to new pilots, while Japanese aces died and took their expertise with them. American doctrine emphasized teamwork over individual heroism. The thatch weave worked because it required two pilots working in perfect coordination, watching each other's backs, turning individual weakness into collective strength. Japanese doctrine, influenced by samurai traditions, often emphasized individual prowess. Exactly what the Americans wanted, because a lone Zero engaging in a turning fight with one wildcat might miss the second wildcat lining up for the kill. Superior training infrastructure made the difference too. The U.S. had the resources to maintain extensive flight schools, conduct realistic combat training, and rotate veterans back to teach. Japan, strangled by submarine warfare and resource shortages, couldn't fuel their training programs adequately. By 1943, Japanese replacement pilots arrived at the front with a fraction of the flying hours their American counterparts possessed. The Wildcat didn't win because it was better on paper. It won because the system around it was better. The pilot who perhaps best exemplified this lesson was Marine ace James Swett, who arrived at Guadalcanal in spring 1943 when the fighting had moved northward. On April 7, 1943, Admiral Yamamoto launched his I-Go offensive, a massive strike involving nearly 400 aircraft, larger than the Pearl Harbor attack force. Lieutenant Swett was flying a routine dawn patrol with 3 other Wildcats when the formation appeared. 160 planes headed straight for Allied positions. Swett attacked alone. In 7 minutes of combat, he shot down 7 Japanese dive bombers, a feat that earned him the Medal of Honor. His Wildcat was so badly damaged that he ditched in Iron Bottom Sound. Rescued by natives in a canoe, Swett exemplified the combination of skill, courage, and the Wildcat's ability to absorb punishment that defined the aircraft's success. The Japanese never adapted. They continued producing Zeros with minimal modifications, believing their superior performance would carry the day. The Zero that dominated in 1941 was essentially the same aircraft fighting in 1945, still unarmored, still vulnerable, still plagued by the same weaknesses. Meanwhile, American aircraft technology leaped forward. The F-6F Hellcat, designed specifically to counter the Zero using lessons learned from Wildcat pilots, entered service in 1943. The F-4U Corsair, even more capable, soon followed. But it was the Wildcat that held the line when holding the line meant everything. At Midway, when the fate of the Pacific hung in balance. At Guadalcanal, during 6 months of brutal attrition that broke Japanese offensive capability. At Coral Sea, where American carriers fought the first naval battle decided entirely by aircraft. The Wildcat achieved what aviation theorists said was impossible. It defeated a technically superior opponent through tactics, training, and sheer determination. It proved that the best aircraft on paper isn't necessarily the best aircraft in combat. That survivability matters as much as performance. That teamwork beats individual skill. That doctrine and training can overcome hardware limitations. These lessons remain relevant today, studied at military academies worldwide. The Wildcat story is taught as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, how to win when you shouldn't be able to. By late 1943, the Wildcat was phasing out of frontline carrier service, replaced by newer, more powerful fighters. But its combat record was undeniable. Total Wildcats built approximately 7,885 aircraft across all variants. Total combat missions, countless thousands from 1941 to 1945. Final kill ratio against the Zero, 6.9 to 1. The stubby little fighter that couldn't turn with a Zero, couldn't climb as fast, couldn't match its range, that fighter had systematically destroyed the myth of Japanese air superiority. Individual pilots had achieved extraordinary success in the Wildcat. Joe Foss, 26 kills. Marion Carl, eventually 18.5 kills, becoming the Marine Corps' leading ace until 1944. Robert Gaylor, 13 kills and a Medal of Honor. John L. Smith, 19 kills, commanding VMF 223. Harold Bauer, 11 kills before being shot down and killed. The list of aces who built their reputations in the F4F reads like an honor roll of American naval aviation. But perhaps the most telling statistic came from the opposition. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces with 64 confirmed kills, recalled an encounter with a wildcat. "I had full confidence in my ability to destroy the Grumman and decided to finish off the enemy fighter with only my 7.7mm machine guns." He failed. The wildcat absorbed his fire and escaped. Sakai learned respect for the American fighter, respect born from combat experience. The wildcat continued serving throughout the war on escort carriers, protecting convoys in the Atlantic from U-boats and supporting landing operations in secondary theaters. Its ruggedness made it ideal for the rough conditions of small carrier operations. Even as better fighters took over fleet carrier duties, the Wildcat remained valuable where reliability mattered more than peak performance. When the Japanese surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard USS Missouri, Wildcats were still in service. The forgotten fighter that everyone expected to lose had instead become one of the war's most successful aircraft. Not through superior technology, but through superior application of available technology. The slow plane won. And in winning, it changed how militaries think about aircraft design, pilot training, and tactical doctrine forever. The aftermath of the Wildcat's success rippled through military aviation for decades. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, which designed the F4F, took the lessons learned and applied them to the F6F Hellcat, a fighter that would become even more dominant with a kill ratio of 19-1 by war's end. The Hellcat incorporated everything pilots loved about the Wildcat: robust construction, heavy armament, excellent visibility, pilot protection, while adding the speed and climb rate that had been missing. The U.S. Navy's fighter doctrine, forged in the crucible of 1942, became the foundation of modern aerial combat. The emphasis on teamwork over individual dogfighting skill, the importance of altitude advantage, the boom and zoom tactics, the defensive weaving maneuvers, all of these principles survived into the jet age and are still taught today. The thatch weave specifically proved so effective that it remained a viable tactic through the Vietnam War. American F-4 Phantom pilots used variations of it against North Vietnamese MiGs. The fundamental principle, two aircraft working together can defeat a superior individual opponent, remains timeless. But the human cost was real. Of the original pilots who landed at Henderson Field in August 1942, few survived the full 6-month campaign without being killed, wounded, or medically evacuated. The casualty rate among Cactus Air Force pilots exceeded 50%. These men fought daily against overwhelming odds, living in conditions that would break most people, knowing that every flight might be their last. They won not because victory was certain, but because defeat was unacceptable. Henderson Field could not fall, Guadalcanal could not fall, the lifeline to Australia could not be cut. So they flew broken aircraft with malfunctioning instruments, fought while sick with malaria and dysentery, and landed on bomb-cratered runways in the dark because that's what the mission required. Their success changed the strategic balance in the Pacific. After Guadalcanal, Japan was on the defensive, never again able to launch major offensive operations. The myth of Japanese invincibility, psychological armor as important as any physical advantage, was shattered. Allied forces could see a path to victory, no matter how long and bloody. The forgotten fighter had become unforgettable. Today, only a handful of F-4F Wildcats remain airworthy, carefully maintained by museums and private collectors. The National Air and Space Museum preserves an FM-1 variant in Washington, D.C., where visitors can see the cramped cockpit, the 6 wing-mounted guns, the compact fuselage that looked so unimpressive compared to the sleek Zero. It's easy to underestimate looking at it on the ground. The Japanese made that mistake. They paid for it with an empire. The modern U.S. Navy still studies the Guadalcanal campaign at its war colleges. Not for the technology, F-4Fs and Zeros are museum pieces now, but for the lessons about leadership, tactical innovation, and winning against the odds. Every naval aviator learns about Jimmy Thatch and his kitchen table innovation. Every Marine pilot learns about Joe Foss's flying circus and Marion Carl's determination. These stories transcend their historical moment because they embodied timeless principles. The Wildcat's legacy lives on in unexpected ways. Every time a pilot uses a two-plane element for mutual support, that's the Thatch weave. Every time engineers prioritize pilot survivability in aircraft design, that's the lesson Grumman taught. Every time trainers emphasize teamwork over individual heroics, that's the doctrine forged at Henderson Field. In 2025, we live in an era of stealth fighters, beyond visual range missiles, and AI-assisted targeting. The technology has advanced beyond anything those 1942 pilots could imagine. But the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do you achieve victory when your opponent has advantages? The answer, proven over the jungles of Guadalcanal 83 years ago, is that the weapon matters less than the warrior wielding it. The F-4F Wildcat was slower, heavier, and less maneuverable than the Zero. On paper, it shouldn't have won. But history isn't written on paper. It's written in the sky, in blood and courage and brilliant tactical thinking. The slow plane won because the men flying it refused to accept defeat. If this story inspired you, subscribe for more verified military history. Drop a comment sharing which aspect of the Wildcat story surprised you most. And remember, in life as in war, success isn't about having the best tools. It's about using the tools you have with maximum skill and courage. Every event, number, and name in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources.